have literally been eat, sleep, breathing Paralympic representation, but also wider kind of thinking about the lens of inclusion and disability in your work.
Can't ignore the fact that this is disabled sport, and it becomes a campaign about disabled sport. So obviously it's intrinsic to the Paralympics. We are much more likely now, I think, to treat diversity and inclusion in our comms as just being another part of it and another thing that we think about, as opposed to something that we bolt on at the end. So like an input at the start rather than something that we think of as an output. And it was something that I don't think we would have been able to achieve as authentically as we did without involving that disabled community in the way that we made it.
Hello and welcome to the Purple Goat podcast. Today I'm joined by James Hamilton, Head of Planning at Channel 4. James and the team have been working with us over the last few years to create the most forward-thinking and progressive Paralympic campaigns out there in the world. And today we talk about that journey, and it's really awesome to hear the kind of work that Channel 4 have been doing behind the scenes from the ground up to drive inclusivity and accessibility into absolutely everything they do. We wanted to do this session really to talk about what we've done in 2024 with some of the most prominent brands that we've worked with, but then also look forward and what the work that we've done in 2024 means for 2025 and beyond. So as a kind of way of starting off, it'd be great if you don't mind just introducing yourself and explain a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how we've worked together.
Okay, so I'm James Hamilton. I run planning at Channel 4, very specifically the more kind of marketing and creative communications side of planning there. I've been there for a long time, 12 years, and as part of that, I've worked on the Paralympics since 2016. So I've been responsible for writing the creative brief and helping with the marketing strategies of, well, 3 summer Paralympics and I think three winter Paralympics, but a lot of Paralympics in that 12 years.
Before you jumped into the world of Paralympics with Channel 4 was either the Paralympics or kind of inclusive representation in media on your radar as a thing, would you say?
Paralympics were, definitely, in that we had tickets to London 2012 and I went there with my 2, at the time, tiny twin babies, and I've got some sort of fond memories of London 2012. Diversity and inclusion, probably back then I used to work in advertising. I worked at a bunch of different advertising agencies, and it was sort of starting to bubble up on the radar, but it wasn't something that many of our clients were, I don't think, actively thinking about at the time.
And now, would you say, you have literally been eat, sleep, breathing Paralympic sort of representation, but also wider kind of thinking about through the lens of inclusion and disability in your work? This is such a broad question, but I suppose if you were going to take that 12 years and say what are some of the key things that you've learned that you didn't know beforehand, what would you say some of those are?
I think that's a good question. I think there's probably 2 ways I'd look at that. And one which is the Paralympics itself is a thing. It's a very separate thing, and it is obviously it's impossible to do. Well, we did explore this. We did think about this, and I remember talking to you about this at the time. But we did explore whether you would even address diversity and inclusion and the word disability as part of Paralympics advertising. What if you were to completely blank that out and just treat it the way the BBC treated the Olympics? If you were to do a campaign that just sort of focused on, the Arc de Triomphe, the Eiffel Tower for Paris 24, and you just did it as a traditional sports ad. But I think we quickly realised in sort of conversation with you and your team and the people we worked with that you can't ignore the fact that this is disabled sport, and it becomes a campaign about disabled sport. So obviously it's intrinsic to the Paralympics. I think the sort of the sort of second point that I alluded to back before I started meandering was that we are much more likely now, I think, to treat diversity and inclusion in our comms as just being another part of it and another thing that we think about, as opposed to something that we bolt on at the end. So like an input at the start rather than something that we think of as an output.
And would you say that you're seeing that being reflected across other Channel 4 output now in a way that 12 years ago maybe you didn't quite see it the same, in the sense of regardless of what the programming is now, regardless of what is being cooked up, even if it's obviously outside of disability and inclusion and Paralympics, there is that input of inclusive thinking, even if it's small, that wasn't previously there maybe 12 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think and it's not just Channel 4. I mean, I think TV in general, it's not there yet. It's not perfect by any means, but it is definitely getting better at diversity and inclusion, at authentic representation, in casting, certainly on screen. I think we've done a huge amount at Channel 4 off screen, so in from a production perspective on the type of people that we're trying to bring into the industry to make sure that we're as representative as possible. It is night and day to when I first joined the industry for sure.
Nice. And when you think about the impact of your work, and again, being in and around this for 12 years already, we often talk about there being kind of the penny drop moment, or you can visibly see or feel the power of inclusive work that we do, or we put our name to. Have you got any kind of standout moments maybe from this last 2024 Paralympics of when you knew you'd kind of hit something that worked and you could see the impact it was having on the people that were seeing it?
I think that there are two big moments there. I don't feel like there's two for everything to these answers, but there was one when you were there, you and your team were there when we first presented like the insight and the tracking research that we did at a kickoff session, and this would be, I'm going to say, like late 22. I mean, it's a long gestation period for a Paralympics campaign. And we presented that stat that the key driver that made people want to watch the Paralympics was this idea of seeing disabled people overcome their disability. And we presented that data in the room as if that's our key driver, and that's a sort of an interesting bit of data, isn't it? And there was that audible intake of breath in the room, and and at that moment, I realised right there and then that was the strategic hook that we would want to hang on. And the term insight is bandied around in my industry like with a sort of wanton abandon, and I've had probably like 3 or 4 genuine insights in my life, and that was one of them, one of the really sort of strong ones where you go, okay, right, yeah, there's something really in that. Now, I don't know whether that was, I couldn't say at that moment quite how that would land with the public and how it would land as a sort of wider campaign, but I knew that that's what we wanted to hang our hat on, challenging that. And I think, again, I can't speak for the countless millions that watched the Paralympics or saw our campaign, but I look at the press and I look at the publicity around what we did, and if I look at the sort of the noise that came out around superhumans compared to the kind of like the kind of publicity that we got, particularly from the disabled community around considering what, and it was just like sort of wholly positive around considering what. This idea that people felt seen, that their experience felt seen, that that we really were challenging something and challenging viewers to think differently about disabled sport. And that was incredibly heartening. And without sort of like bigging you up too much, like being a non-disabled person, it was something that was very difficult for me to sort of get my head around until I saw it through the eyes of right back at that session, that original planning session. And it was something that I don't think we would have been able to achieve as authentically as we did without involving that disabled community in the way that we made it.
I remember at that session, I prodded when that was being sort of shown on the screen. I was prodding my colleague, and then we snuck a photo of the insight. And the thing, because in that moment, it was the thing, like you say, that was the aha moment of, oh my word, that insight is shockingly powerful. And we have those moments a lot where you work with a brand and you say to them, actually, if we do this piece of insight, we are going to be able to push something further. We're going to be able to do something different and actually more creative than we might have otherwise been able to do, because the insight gives us the mandate. It gives us the ability to go, well, look, we're following the rabbit hole of reality, and that can take us into some weird, wonderful, but really exciting
it's
places
just a
as well.
Really powerful truth, isn't it? You start picking at it and unraveling it, and you realise that there's something in this. And we took that idea of okay, so we actually had a brief that, rather than say something about the Paralympics, we wanted people watching to feel something, and we wanted people to feel uncomfortable with whatever we made. Now, the rest of the brief didn't just say make viewers feel uncomfortable. There was a whole lot of, well, why do you want to make people feel uncomfortable, and what's the problem, and what's the solution that this communications is going to provide. And that was obviously that a predominantly non-disabled audience sees, watches disabled sport for this idea of overcoming, for that kind of, it was like people sort of talked about disability porn a lot in this sort of in the discourse that we explored around this. And we spoke to a bunch of Paralympians, present and former, about it, and we spoke to you and your community about it. And look, we got to this place in that brief that sort of, unpicking that insight or that truth gets you to this place of, well, these are athletes like any other athletes, and nobody talks about other athletes at overcoming anything. Nobody talks about a Premiership footballer going, oh, it's amazing how well he does, considering he comes from a sort of single parent family. And it's I think it was really noteworthy that someone like Mo Farah didn't mention his sort of trafficked past until he had retired, until it became something that was, his legacy was absolutely sort of solidly in place. He didn't want that idea of any kind of pity watch. And so we kept pulling at that and going, well, okay, so what, if we've got this idea of overcome, we want our non-disabled audience to overcome these patronising ideas about disability. And how do we do that? Well, what are disabled athletes overcoming? If they're not overcoming their disability, because obviously they can't, it's just who they are, what are they overcoming? And it was the same things that all athletes are trying to overcome, time, gravity, friction, or those sort of fundamental forces that are trying to prevent you from being as good as you can be.
If you take the impact of 2024 and you sort of try and predict what that will have for I say the industry, but I mean, I suppose, both the impact on the inclusive conversation in media and advertising, but also the impact of Paralympics moving forward in the way that they're broadcast, and the coverage in and around it. What would you say you think the impact of 2024 hopefully would be?
Well, hopefully it would. at a sort of Paralympics in particular and disability in general perspective, it would. I hope it has challenged some of those patronising views. That is, encouraged people to think slightly differently. I don't think it's job done. I don't think you can just do that with a single campaign or in a single category like the Paralympics and say, oh, we've done that now and we need to move on. I think it's a thread that I would keep picking at and keep working at, because I think it's a really powerful truth to explore. I think it's as a sort of a wider learning. I think that idea of being slightly confrontational in the way that you present these questions, these issues, is important. That we shouldn't pad around these things. Like if the prevailing attitude or perspective towards, in this case, disability, but there's obviously a whole there's a whole raft of diversity and inclusion targets that we could look at. But if the way to attack that is to be a little bit more, not aggressive, but to be a little bit more confrontational and challenging in the way that you present people, either present people's views back to them or encourage them to think about things in a different way, then I'd heartily encourage it. And I think that's possibly something that we could learn and apply, and other brands could apply.
And is that something that you professionally will probably take forward? Just almost adding that bit of spice to conversations to sort of get people doing that same bit of self-questioning, like questioning their own choices and why they're making them, and if there's any kind of presumptions that are going on in the way that they've arrived at that idea, and actually almost just challenging that from the ground up.
I mean, yes, you always like to think that you are going into, if we're talking professionally about me, that you always like to think that you are challenging your preconceptions, and that whatever you like, that you come to these things with a sort of very open mind, as an open slate, and that you will park any prejudices you have and preconceptions at the door. I mean, that takes work. That's not something that we're an inherently lazy species, and we will come to those things with, a preconceived idea of what the answer is. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to think that it will at least make me sort of stop and question, because that was for us, received wisdom for us for a while, and we lent into that, and it's good to challenge these things.
Do you think, and I've spoken about this with a few kind of creatives before, but I find it fascinating that as an industry, if you go back to the days of Mad Men and when that was shot, and the kind of head honcho advertising mogul in that world, they are kind of applauded for their ability to get in the psyche of the common man, as it were, mm-hmm. and that level of empathy that is required to put yourself in someone else's shoes and essentially like think for them almost to create great work. That obviously there is an element of having that natural empathy of sorts, or ability to kind of think how something is going to land with an audience. But it's fascinating that, to me, that in the time that I've been in the world of marketing and advertising, we're taking the shift away from sort of inherent empathy as this sort of golden ticket of ability to actually it's how you pull resources, communities, insights, and then digest that and then almost produce something with all of those inputs, rather than it being just a sole sort of individual and what they do with their own mind, as it were.
I mean, that's definitely the case. I think. I mean, I would sort of question Don Draper's empathy. He's more of a sociopath, and his ability to weaponize emotion is and the advertising industry is there are a lot of sort of storied examples of campaigns that are very good at manipulating people into thinking or feeling and then behaving in a certain way. But I agree. I think, the days of the kind of sort of lone gunslinger, planner or creative who would sort of come in and go, here's the answer, here's what we do. I think those are arguably long gone, and the benefit that comes from a much more sort of a sort of multiplicity of voices and backgrounds and experiences is generally, in my experience, better. I think there's still a case for the occasional creative campaign. I used to work at an agency called Fallon, where the famous bouncing balls ad for Sony. There was no research, there was no strategy, there was nothing in that. It was just a creative vision. Somebody said this will look good, it'll sell a shed load of tellies, and it did. And anything that's been said about that ad after the event is an imagination of how it was sold or how it was produced. It is a very pure creative vision. But I think it's doing a very, very different job to the one that we are trying to do, or certainly the one that we were trying to do with the Paralympics. And I think that requires a much more nuanced, just to understand and hear the different voices who are being represented there.
And if you look forward to 2025 as an individual, I suppose, what do you want to carry forward from your experience on the Paras, but also the work like maybe we've done together, into what you're going to try and see, almost like New Year's resolution vibes, in more like what you're going to bring into your work into 2025 based on what's happened in 2024?
I think, I mean, as we said, not relying on sort of tried and tested ways of doing things just because you think you understand them. Bake Off's now been at Channel 4 for longer than it was at the BBC. It's something that's sort of we know inside out now. There's always something new to find out about these things. There's always there's always another way in, and another perhaps a more sort of powerful way to talk about these things if you involve communities, if you sort of get actually on the ground with people and talk to them about maybe I'll be spending my time with bakers this year. And
if you could sort of implore our listeners, our viewers, our community, our advertisers to take one thing into 2025 themselves, what would that be?
See this as an opportunity. See diversity and inclusion not as something that you bolt on at the end of your campaign, so that you can be seen to be delivering on some kind of corporate metrics, but see it as an opportunity to talk to a very valuable audience if you want to be sort of nakedly commercial about it, but also just it's 2025. This is the world that we live in, and the world that we see day in, day out isn't necessarily the one that is projected to us in marketing communications, and it would just be nice for things to just feel a little bit more realistic.
I think you're allowed to coin the phrase "nakedly commercial" now. That's excellent. I've never framed it in that way, but that's great because it's true. It's like we often talk about brands being commercial because it's like a good growth opportunity, but we say, oh, this is great growth opportunity, but nakedly commercial. It says what it is on the tin. So
yeah,
we'll have to put the title of something like that, a date about being nakedly commercial. But thank you so much, and
Dom, thank you. It's been a pleasure,
and I look forward to seeing what the next 12 months brings you, and we'll no doubt catch up again very soon.
We will. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thanks so much for watching the podcast. We also want to thank our friends at ID Studios, who so wonderfully host us for all of our podcasts. If you have any podcast needs yourself, we highly recommend them. Not only is their space inclusive, accessible, they are also just a great group of people. So please reach out and they will be more than happy to accommodate you.